7 years after Garrison Webb walked out of her life without a word. Adeline Cross had stopped waiting, but she had never stopped being careful. She had learned caution the hard way. Back in Galton, a small farming town east of the Ottawa Valley, people had watched her with the patient curiosity of those who expect a spectacle and are willing to wait for it. When Garrison left, they offered her two things: pity and a theory. The pity was sincere enough. The theory, that she had driven him away by being too proud, too bookish, too unwilling to bend, was the kind of thing people said when they could not explain a man's failures and needed somewhere else to put the weight. Adeline had not argued. She had simply packed her trunk, said goodbye to the house, where her mother once hung laundry in the summer wind, and taken the train west to Thornfield. Thornfield was a mill town built on the edge of a good river, the kind of place that kept itself busy enough not to ask too many questions. Harmon and Sons dry goods merchant needed a bookkeeper. Adeline was accurate, quiet, and reliable. No one in Thornfield knew her history, and for 2 years she had kept it that way. She rented a room at Winifred Platt's boarding house on Maple Street. Winifred was a young widow with quick hands and a quicker laugh, who made strong tea every morning and minded her own business the rest of the day. Also in the house was old Opal Dunbar, who had opinions on everything and shared all of them freely. It was Opal who first said what the others only thought. "You hold yourself like a woman who's been looked at wrong for a long time," Opal told Adeline one evening, not unkindly, from her rocking chair by the fire. "Whatever they did to you back where you came from, they won't do it here." Adeline had not answered, but something in her had loosened slightly. Like a knot pulled just a fraction of an inch. She found in Thornfield what Galton had never offered her: a desk of her own. Columns of numbers that answered honestly when she asked them the right questions. The respect of Mr. Edward Harmon, who paid her fairly and said once, without embellishment, "I'd be in a sorry state without you, Miss Cross." She had bought herself a new coat that winter. She had started reading again. Not secretly, not late at night with a hand over the lamp, but openly, in the parlor, while Winifred sewed, and Opal pretended not to listen to whatever Adeline read aloud. It was not a large life, but it was hers. Nathan Spence was not the kind of man who announced himself. He came into the Harmon store twice a week to collect mail and supplies for his surveying work, north of town, paid without complaint, and left without lingering. He had the quietness of a man who had thought things through carefully and decided that most noise was unnecessary. Adeline first noticed him for a practical reason. He always returned exact change. Once, when Mr. Harmon was away and Adeline was minding the counter, Nathan overpaid by 4 cents on a bolt of rope and came back 20 minutes later to correct it. He did not make a show of the honesty. He set the coins on the counter, said, "I was 4 cents short on my end," and waited until she verified it before he left. She thought about that for days. He was 44 years old, she would learn later. A lean, serious man with a surveyor's habit of measuring everything before he moved. His wife, Eleanor, had died of scarlet fever 6 years ago. He rarely spoke of her, but when he did, it was without bitterness, only with the careful grief of a man who knew what he had lost and did not need to dramatize it. Prudence Vail worked in the office of Thornfield's solicitor, Mr. Frederick Lethbridge, with ink-stained fingers and the precise posture of someone who had taught herself to take up exactly as much space as she was given. She was 31, sharp as a February morning. She and Adeline had become friends over a disputed bill the previous winter, and the friendship had held. In the spring of 1907, a letter arrived from Galton. Adeline's Aunt Florence Birch had died in March, and she had left, through Mr. Lethbridge's counterpart in Galton, a piece of farmland on the Madawaska Road. The property was modest, 12 acres, a small house in want of repair, an orchard that still bore well in good years. Adeline had not known Aunt Florence well, but she had been the only member of the family who had never offered Adeline pity or theories. She had simply sent every Christmas a tin of shortbread and a note that said nothing more than, "I think of you, dear." The bequest landed in Adeline's chest like an unexpected kindness. She took the letter to Prudence, who read it twice with a solicitor's thoroughness, and said, "I can manage the paperwork through Lethbridge's office. It will take some weeks, but there's nothing complicated here." What neither of them knew, in that spring, was that the railway surveyors had been quietly walking the Madawaska Road all winter. The line they planned to cut west would pass within a mile of Florence's orchard. The land that had seemed modest was, to someone paying attention, suddenly worth considerably more. Garrison Webb was paying attention. He arrived in Thornfield on a Tuesday in June, when the air smelled of river water and new lumber, and the lilacs were just past their peak. He came on foot from the train station, which meant he had been watching, had known which stop to take. Adeline saw him first from the window of the Harmon store. He was standing across the street, reading the sign above the door. He was thinner than she remembered. Thin in the way of a man who had moved through difficult places and left pieces of himself behind. His coat was decent but well worn, and he carried a single bag. When he looked up and saw her through the glass, he smiled. It was the same smile. That was what frightened her. She did not run to the door. She stood very still behind the counter, and reminded herself that she was 32 years old, that she had a coat of her own, and a desk of her own, and a salary that arrived on the first of every month without her having to ask for it. She reminded herself of all of this very carefully. The way you check your footing before crossing ice. He came in slowly, as though he knew he did not have the right to hurry. "Adeline," he said, "I've been trying to find the words for 7 years." She said nothing. He spoke for a long time, there between the bolts of calico and the jars of preserved peaches. He spoke of mistakes, of running when he should have stayed, of how the years had taught him what he had thrown away. He was not an unintelligent man, and he chose his words carefully. And some of them landed in the old tender places that she had thought were healed. But something else was present in the room, a quality she could not name at first, until she realized. He had not asked how she was. He had not asked what her life looked like now, or whether she was happy or whether Thornfield suited her. He had spoken entirely about himself, his absence, his feelings, his regrets. The conversation had been arranged, she understood slowly, so that she would only ever see the version of the story he needed her to see. She told him she would need time. She told him nothing else. That evening, Winifred and Opal sat with her at the kitchen table. Winifred poured tea and said very little. Opal said more than enough. "Men who disappear for 7 years and come back with a speech," Opal said, "generally have a reason that has nothing to do with love." "He said he's changed," Adeline offered, more to test the words than to defend them. "Changed men," Opal replied, "don't usually need to announce it quite so thoroughly." Mrs. Eugenia Ord held a different opinion. Mrs. Eugenia Ord was the wife of Thornfield's mill superintendent, and she occupied that social position with the cheerful authority of someone born to it. She was not unkind. She was generous in the way of women who have never had to be economical with their generosity. But she had views, and her views were settled the way old furniture is settled. Not because anyone had chosen their placement, but because they had simply been there long enough to seem permanent. She found Adeline at the church social on Saturday, and drew her aside with a warm hand on the arm. "A woman who has waited faithfully deserves to be rewarded," Mrs. Ord said, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering wisdom they are certain of. "Mr. Webb made mistakes, but a man who comes back to make them right is showing you something true about his character." Adeline looked at her steadily. "And a woman who has built her own life," she said carefully. "What does she deserve?" Mrs. Ord's smile remained, but her eyes flickered. It was not a question she had a prepared answer for. Nathan Spence said nothing about Garrison Webb. which was its own kind of answer. But he watched. Not with jealousy, not with the proprietary attention of a man who believes he has a claim. He watched the way he watched terrain before he mapped it, with patience and a surveyor's attention to what did not fit. He noticed the slight tremor in Garrison's right hand. He noticed that Garrison always positioned himself so that Adeline had to look up at him, never level. He noticed that. When Adeline spoke, Garrison's eyes moved, not to her face, but slightly past it, as though her words were background to a calculation he was already running in his head. On a Monday morning in late June, Nathan rode out to walk the Madawaska Road property. He had no official reason to. The surveying contract was for the railway, and the lines he was marking ran adjacent to, not through, Florence's farm. But something had been sitting sideways in his thinking, and a lifetime of working land had taught him to trust that feeling. He spent the morning with his instruments and his notebook. What he found when he checked his records against the county maps at the Thornfield registry was this. Garrison Webb had made inquiries, through a land agent in Ottawa, about purchasing the Birch property. The inquiries were dated to March, before Adeline had received Florence's letter, before anyone in Thornfield had reason to know the property existed. Someone had known. Nathan sat with this for the better part of an afternoon. Then, he went to Prudence Vail's office and laid the documents on her desk, without preamble. Prudence read them with the careful stillness of someone doing mathematics in their head. Then, she said quietly, "Leave these with me." She worked methodically, the way she did everything. It took 4 days. She wrote to the Manitoba Registrar's office, to the Land Titles office in Winnipeg, to a contact at a firm there who had once done her a favor and owed her the return of it. On the 5th day, she received a reply. Garrison Emmett Webb had been married, on the 14th of September, 1903, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, to a woman named Cecile Moreau, the daughter of a Quebec merchant who had herself been waiting for Garrison to honor a promise he had made to her family in 1901. The marriage was registered and legally binding. There had been no divorce petition. There was no dissolution of any kind. Garrison Webb was a married man. Prudence read the reply twice, folded it into her coat pocket, and walked to Winifred Platt's boarding house. She found Adeline in the upstairs sitting room, reading, with the lamp low and the window open to the June evening. Adeline looked up and seemed to understand from Prudence's expression that something had shifted. "Sit down," Prudence said, and sat down herself first. She told her everything, plainly and without softening. The land agent inquiries in March, before Adeline knew about the inheritance. The marriage in Winnipeg in 1903, 4 years after Garrison had left Galton and 2 years before anyone had told Adeline there was any reason to stop expecting a letter. The legal fact that made his proposal not only unwanted but criminal. Adeline did not speak for a long time. Through the window, she could hear the sounds of the summer street. Children somewhere, a cart on the road, the distant rhythm of the mill. Ordinary sounds, the world continuing its business while everything she had quietly assumed about the past 7 years rearranged itself into a different shape. He had not come back because he had changed. He had come back because he had learned about the land. The pity she might have kept for him, the residue of old feeling, dried up quietly, the way water dries from warm stone. What replaced it was not rage, though perhaps it should have been. What replaced it was something cleaner, clarity, the particular calm of a woman who has just been handed the exact truth and finds, to her own surprise, that she is strong enough to hold it. "Thank you," Adeline said to Prudence. "Thank you for finding this." "You deserve to know," Prudence said. "You always deserve to know the truth. It just took a while to catch up to you." Adeline found Garrison the following evening, on the path along the river, where he had taken to walking, as though the scenic route of Thornfield was something he had always enjoyed, and not a location he had chosen. because it was private. He saw her coming and smiled again. That same smile with its old confidence. She had once thought it was charm. She understood now that it was a kind of strategy. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, and she watched him settle into expectation. "I've been thinking about what it means that you found me here in Thornfield this particular spring." His expression shifted, just slightly. "I looked into things," Adeline continued. "As it turns out, you spoke to a land agent in Ottawa about Aunt Florence's property in March, before I knew about that property myself." The smile faded. "And in Manitoba," she said, "there is a woman named Cecile Moreau who has been your legal wife since September of 1903. For a moment, the only sound was the river moving through its stones. Garrison's face did what she had never seen it do before. It went utterly still, the calculation visible for just a second before something harder took its place. "You don't understand what happened," he said. "That was a mistake, a situation I was trapped in. Adeline, what I feel for you, what you feel for my aunt's land," she said, and her voice did not shake, "is the one honest thing in this whole arrangement. I know about the railway coming through the Madawaska Road. I know what that makes 12 acres worth, and I know you have been in this town exactly long enough to make a woman grateful before you make her sign a paper." He looked at her then with the eyes of a man who has been found out and is calculating whether anger or appeal will serve him better. He chose appeal. "I have made terrible mistakes," he said, "but I have thought of you every day. I came back because—" "You came back," Adeline said quietly, "when there was something here to come back for. You did not write for 7 years. You did not come when I had nothing. You came in June after the railway surveys, with a land agent's number in your pocket and a speech that you had clearly rehearsed." She took one step back, because she did not need to be close to him for this. "I don't hate you," she said. "That is the honest truth. But I will not be taken in by a man who mistook my patience for weakness and my grief for a lever. And I will not let the law pretend I owe you what I never agreed to give." Garrison said nothing. His jaw tightened. The appeal had failed, and she was done waiting to see which version of himself he would choose next. She had made her choice. When she turned to walk back toward the road, Nathan Spence was standing at the edge of the path near the birch trees. He was not close. He had not come to intervene. He held his hat in his hands and looked at her, not at Garrison, and gave a single small nod. "I am here. That is all this means." Prudence had come too, standing a little behind Nathan, with Winifred Platt at her side. They had not planned an entrance. They had simply been in the same vicinity, drawn by the same instinct. Garrison looked at them, took the measure of it, and left without another word. His footsteps on the gravel diminished and then disappeared entirely. Winifred let out a breath. "Good Lord," she said. "Men like that always go when the money goes with them," said Opal Dunbar, materializing from the shadow of the trees the way Opal always materialized, at exactly the moment her presence would be most useful and least explicable. At the next church social, Mrs. Eugenia Ord sought Adeline out with something different in her expression. The warm certainty was not entirely gone, but it had developed an uncharacteristic hesitation. "I heard," she said, "that Mr. Webb was not the man I had taken him for." "No," Adeline agreed. Mrs. Ord folded her hands and looked at something past Adeline's shoulder. "I may have spoken too quickly," she said, "when I told you what a faithful woman deserves. I was thinking of devotion as though it were something a woman performs, as though the result of performing it long enough was guaranteed." She paused. "That is not wisdom. That is a story we were handed and never examined." It was more honest than Adeline had expected from her. "It's a story that suits some people well enough," Adeline said, not unkindly, "just not all of us." The Birch property resolved itself through Mr. Lethbridge's patient administration and Prudence's impeccable paperwork. Adeline let it on a modest lease to a farming family from Renfrew, who wanted the orchard and were glad of the house. The quarterly income was not remarkable, but it paid for things she had previously gone without. A better lamp for reading, new teaching materials, a subscription to a lending library in Ottawa that sent books up by post. Because in September, the Thornfield School Board posted a notice that they were accepting applications for the primary grade. Adeline applied on a Tuesday and was hired on a Thursday, with the stipulation that she continue half-days at the Harmon store through the end of the season to allow them time to find a replacement. The first morning she stood in front of 23 children in the small schoolroom on Oak Street. She felt something she had not felt in nearly a decade. The particular usefulness of a person doing exactly the work they were made for. The children were loud and uncertain and wonderfully imprecise. She told them that the world was larger than any room they had ever sat in, and that the business of her classroom was to hand them the tools to move through it. Honestly, one girl in the second row, with serious eyes and a missing front tooth, raised her hand and asked, "Did you used to be a teacher before?" "Yes," Adeline said. "I stopped for a while. I've started again." The girl seemed satisfied with this. So did Adeline. Nathan Spence called at the boarding house one evening in October when the maples had gone red, and the air had the particular sharpness of a Canadian autumn that knows what is coming and does not pretend otherwise. He had been north for most of September on a surveying contract and had returned with the bearing of a man who has been in his own company long enough to know clearly what he thinks. He stood in Winifred's front parlor with his hat in his hand and asked if he might speak to Adeline. Winifred showed him in with the careful neutrality of a woman working very hard to look unconcerned, then retreated to the kitchen, where she and Opal almost certainly listened at the door. Nathan said he was not a man who was easy with words. He said this not as an apology but as a courtesy, so she would know what to expect. He said he had been observing her, not in the way of a man who watches because he wants to own what he sees, but in the way of someone who recognizes something they respect and wants to say so plainly. He said, "You handled everything this summer with more steadiness than most people could manage. I watched you go through something that would have bent a lot of people, and you came out the other side, thinking clearly and acting decently. That is not a small thing." He said, "I would like to court you, if you're willing. I don't mean rush you or press you, or make any kind of argument about what you owe me for standing near a river path in June. I mean come here on Fridays, and have supper with you, and Winifred, and Opal, and walk with you on Saturdays if the weather holds, and see whether what I think I know about you turns out to be true." He stopped and waited. Adeline looked at him, this quiet, careful man, who returned exact change and stood on the edge of gravel paths, who measured things before he moved through them, and carried his grief without making it anyone else's burden. "What do you think you know about me?" she asked. "That you are considerably more," he said, "than what happened to you." She was quiet for a moment. In the kitchen, there was a muffled sound that might have been Opal trying not to make one. "Fridays," Adeline said, "and you will need to bring something to contribute to supper. Winifred does not cook for free." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll bring pie," he said. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no declaration that swept language off its feet, no speech-making of the kind Garrison Webb had always done well. There was only the plain and particular comfort of two people agreeing to something honest, in a warm room, in October, with the maple leaves turning red outside the window, and Opal Dunbar pretending in the kitchen that she could not hear any of it. There were no shortcuts in what followed. Nathan brought pie on Fridays, good pie, from the bakery on King Street. As it turned out, he was not a baker, which Adeline considered a reasonable limitation in an otherwise reasonable man. They walked on Saturdays. They argued once, in December, about the proper method of recording a disputed land boundary. which was an argument so particular in its subject matter that it could only have been happening between two people who had genuinely paid attention to each other's lives. They resolved it by both being partly right. By the following spring, Thornfield had come to regard them the way a town regards a certain bridge or a reliable clock tower, not with excitement, but with the quiet satisfaction of something that has simply always been exactly where it belongs. In May, beneath the new leaves of the maples along Oak Street, Nathan asked Adeline a different kind of question. He asked it on a Tuesday, not a Friday, because he found he could not wait until the end of the week, and he said. Later he had not known. He could not wait until he found himself standing outside the school at 3 in the afternoon, while the children were leaving, and Adeline was erasing the morning's arithmetic from the board. She said yes, not because she had been waiting and was grateful to be chosen, not because the town would approve, or because anyone had told her it was time. She said yes because she had learned the difference that past year between love that arrives asking to be saved and love that arrives asking only to stand beside you on level ground. She had learned, too, in the hardest possible way, that the truth does not diminish love. It protects it. It is the only thing that can be trusted to hold when everything else has been tried and found wanting. On a clear September morning, with the school's beginning of year bell still ringing 2 streets over, Adeline Cross became Adeline Spence in a quiet ceremony at the Thornfield United Church, with Prudence Vail as her witness, Winifred Platt crying openly into her handkerchief, and Opal Dunbar insisting loudly, to no one in particular, that she had something in her eye. Nathan held her hand as if he had been trusted with something that mattered, which, she supposed, he had. And if the September light came through the church windows at a particular angle, gold and late summer warm, and if the maples outside were already beginning to turn, and if there was, somewhere in the distance, the sound of children being called in from their last games of the season, well, some moments do not need embellishment. They are simply and completely enough. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like and share it. It truly helps keep these tales alive. Subscribe to Awesome Tales by Joy so you never miss the next one. And before you go, leave a rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'll see you in the next tale.